The boy's small hand grabbed the hem of the billionaire's suit, and the crowd at a Swama Central terminal fell silent. A single word cut through the noise of train whistles and vendor calls. "Dad!" Adebayo Okoro froze. The utterance was a physical blow, a stunning system shock that rippled through the fabric of his perfectly controlled world. All around, a sea of faces turned, their curiosity sharp and immediate. Phones were already emerging from pockets, small dark rectangles aimed directly at him. His security detail Femi moved instantly, a large hand ready to brush the child away. "Sir," the bodyguard murmured, his voice a low rumble of containment. Adebayo raised a single finger, a gesture that stopped his head of security cold. He looked down. The boy was small, maybe 5 years old, with huge dark eyes filled with a terrifying absolute certainty. The child's clothes were clean but faded, a stark contrast to the immaculate thousand-seti tailoring of Adebayo's trousers. "Dad, you came back," the little one said again, his voice softer now but no less clear. Whispers erupted in the crowd. "Is that Adebayo Okoro? Whose child is that?" The air crackled with the energy of an unfolding scandal. This was a disaster, a catastrophic, unplannable PR nightmare. The magnate's mind, usually a fortress of calm calculation, was a vortex of damage control scenarios. He was about to gesture for Femi to handle it, to remove the child gently but firmly when his gaze caught something. Around the boy's neck on a simple leather cord hung a pendant. It was not a cheap piece of plastic. It was a small hand-carved bird of dark, lustrous ebony wood, its head turned backwards. A sankofa. Its surface was worn smooth, the sharp edges softened by years of touch. Adebayo's breath hitched. He knew that carving. He recognized the specific nick on the bird's left wing where his knife had slipped more than a decade ago. He had made it himself, in another lifetime, for a woman he had tried to systematically erase from his memory. Imani. Just as the name surfaced in his mind, a woman pushed through the ring of onlookers. She moved with a quiet urgency, her face a mask of frantic composure. Her attire was simple, practical, but she carried herself with a dignity that seemed to push the gawking crowd back. "Kalo!" she called out, her voice strained. The boy looked up, his grip on Adebayo's suit finally loosening. "Mama, I found him. I told you he would come." The woman's eyes met the billionaire's. The shock of recognition was mutual, a silent, violent collision across a gap of 12 years. It was Imani Jabari. Her face was fuller, etched with lines of worry he didn't recognize, but her eyes were the same, direct, unwavering, and right now filled with a deep, consuming panic. She reached her son, scooping him up into her arms. She didn't look at the tycoon again. Her focus was entirely on Kalo, her hand protectively covering the Sankofa necklace as if trying to hide it from view. "We have to go," she whispered to the boy, turning to leave. The crowd began to buzz again, sensing the end of the drama. But Adebayo couldn't let it conclude like this. This wasn't just a random encounter. It was a variable, an unknown element introduced into his meticulously planned life. "Wait," he said. The word was low, but carried the unmistakable weight of command. Imani stopped, her back still to him. He could see the tension in her shoulders. He took a step forward, his security detail moving with him like shadows. The spectators hushed again. His mind was racing, connecting the dots with cold, terrifying speed. The child. The pendant. Her. It was an equation with only one possible, unthinkable solution. "Oh, that necklace," Adebayo started, his voice a tight, controlled rasp. "Where did you get it?" She finally turned, her chin lifted in a gesture of defiance he remembered all too well. Her eyes were now hard, protective. "It was a gift. A long time ago." "From who?" he pressed, though he already knew the answer. "From a man who no longer exists," she retorted, her words sharp enough to cut. She adjusted Kalo in her arms, preparing to flee. The boy buried his face in her shoulder, suddenly overwhelmed. Adebayo looked from her defiant face to the small child clutching her neck. He saw the shape of his own jawline in the youngster's face, the same intensity in his dark eyes. It was impossible. It was a complication that threatened everything. The merger with Nwosu Holdings, his engagement to Zola, the entire unassailable empire he had built on the ashes of his past. Imani began to push her way back through the crowd, which parted for her reluctantly. She was escaping, taking the answer with her. Femi leaned in close. "Sir, your car is ready." We need to go before this gets on the blogs. Adebayo watched her disappear into the throng of travelers. The scene was already dissolving. People were pulling out their phones not to record, but to tweet, to message, to spread the story. The digital firestorm was already beginning. He stood motionless for a moment, the ghost of the boy's small hand still on his suit. He felt the phantom weight of the ebony bird, a symbol of learning from the past, a past he had paid billions to bury. The magnate turned to his head of security, his face an unreadable mask of stone. The calculated calm was back, locking into place like the door of a vault. The shock was contained. Now came the strategy. He got into the back of his armored sedan, the door closing with a heavy, soundproof thud, shutting out the chaos of the station. The world outside became a silent movie. Femi sat in the passenger seat, looking into the rearview mirror, waiting for instructions. Adebayo straightened his tie, a precise, methodical gesture. He looked at the security chief's reflection in the mirror, his own eyes cold and clear. "Find her," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "I don't care what it takes. I want her name, her address, her entire life story on my desk by morning." He paused, his gaze turning to the window, watching the city blur past, and find out everything about that boy. Femi was ruthlessly efficient. Less than 12 hours after the chaos at the terminal, a slim digital file lay open on Adebayo's penthouse desk. Imani Jabari, age 39, residence Block 14, Bako Quarter, a world away from the gleaming steel and glass of his own neighborhood. Her dossier contained academic records, a sparse employment history with environmental NGOs, and one other critical attachment, a birth certificate. For Akelo Jabari, mother Imani Jabari, father undeclared. Adebayo stared at the word. It was a blank space that screamed louder than any name. He closed the tablet and stood, walking to the panoramic window that overlooked Asawama City. The metropolis was a glittering circuit board of light, a kingdom he had built. Now a single undeclared variable threatened the entire system. He drove himself, not in the armored sedan, but in a sleek, anonymous black coupe from his private collection. The Bako Quarter was a maze of vibrant, crowded streets, the air thick with the smell of cooking oil and charcoal smoke. He found Block 14, a modest but well-kept building painted a cheerful yellow. On a small balcony on the third floor, a woman was tending to a collection of potted herbs. It was Imani. He climbed the concrete stairs, his expensive leather shoes silent on the steps. He knocked. The door opened a moment later. She stood there, wiping her hands on her trousers, her expression guarded, weary. She wasn't surprised to see him. "You found me," she said. It wasn't a question. "I told you I would," he replied, his voice even. She didn't invite him in. They stood in the doorway, an invisible wall of years and secrets between them. The sound of a child's laughter echoed from inside the apartment. "What do you want, Adebayo?" He cut straight to the point, treating it like a hostile negotiation. "Is he my son?" Her gaze didn't waver. She crossed her arms, her hand unconsciously brushing against the ebony bird at her neck, which she wore today. "You've been gone for 12 years. Why do you care now?" "That isn't an answer." "It's the only one you're getting," she stated, her voice low and firm. He saw it then. The pride. The unshakable wall she had built around herself and Kalo, a barrier his influence couldn't breach and his money couldn't buy. It was infuriating. It was illogical. This is not a game, Imani. There are significant consequences." "I've lived with the consequences for 5 years," she shot back. "You're just meeting them." He took a step back, recalibrating. This required a different strategy, not persuasion. Proof. "I want a DNA test." Her eyes narrowed. "No." "It's non-negotiable," he asserted, his voice turning to ice. "A sterile scientific answer. It's the cleanest way. For everyone." She stared at him for a long moment, a flicker of an old pain crossing her face before it was replaced by a hard resignation. The woman saw he would not be deterred. He would use his power, his lawyers, his entire arsenal to get what he wanted. "Fine," she finally conceded, the word tasting like defeat. "But on my terms. My doctor. My clinic. You pay." Done. The test was arranged with cold corporate speed. A sterile facility. A swab of his cheek, a swab of the boy's. Kylo looked at him with wide, curious eyes, clutching his mother's hand and humming a soft tune under his breath. Adebayo felt nothing. No connection. Just the unnerving ticking of a clock. 3 days later, an encrypted email arrived. He opened it in his office, Zola sitting across from him, her posture perfect, her expression neutral. She had insisted on being there for the result. The document loaded. A string of genetic markers. A final, stark conclusion at the bottom. Probability of paternity, 99.9999%. The numbers seemed to burn on the screen. It was real. A confirmed, undeniable fact. Adebayo leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning under his weight. He felt a strange, hollow sensation, like a hostile takeover of his own bloodline. Zola did not react with tears or anger. She didn't even look at him. His fiancée examined the screen, her brilliant mind already processing the data, assessing the threat. She tapped a perfectly manicured finger on the polished mahogany of his desk. "So," she said, her voice as calm and precise as a surgeon's scalpel, "the variable is confirmed. Now we move to containment." The magnate looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means this story has an unacceptable protagonist," Zola explained, finally turning her cool gaze to him. "A struggling single mother, a lost love, a secret child. The media will turn her into a saint and you into a villain. It's a narrative that will damage the Okoro power brand and, more importantly, jeopardize the merger." "What do you suggest?" he asked, already knowing he was handing her the reins. Her lips curved into a faint, chilling smile. "My father taught me that you don't fight a fire. You starve it of oxygen. We don't need to silence this woman. We need to make her unbelievable. We need to assassinate her characters so thoroughly that no one will ever listen to a word she says." She stood up, walking over to his window and looking down at the city below. "This Imani, she is now a liability to my family's legacy, and I do not tolerate liabilities." Zola turned back to him, her eyes glittering with a terrifying resolve. "Leave it to me. I will handle it." The first move was Zola's, but she used Adebayo as the weapon. It was a strategic masterstroke, forcing his hand, making him complicit. "An offer of this magnitude must come directly from you," she had instructed, her voice leaving no room for argument. "It shows magnanimity. It will also be her first and only chance to cooperate." So he drove back to the Bako quarter, his stomach a tight knot of something he refused to name. He found Imani sitting on a bench in the small, dusty park across from her building, watching Kalo chase a flock of pigeons. She saw his car pull up and her body stiffened. The billionaire approached her not as a father or a former lover, but as a CEO presenting a final, generous severance package. He stood before her, a dark, expensive suit in a world of vibrant, sun-faded colors. "Imani, we need to talk." "We have nothing to discuss," she said, her eyes fixed on her son. "I disagree." He held out a sleek, leather-bound folder. "This is a proposal. A solution." She looked at the portfolio, then back at his face, her expression unreadable. He opened it for her. Inside were architectural renderings, legal documents, bank transfer authorizations. "I will establish a foundation, in your name. It will build a new community center here, a clinic, clean water infrastructure for the entire quarter. I will fund scholarships for every child in this neighborhood, Kalo included." He paused, letting the weight of the offer sink in. "And I will deposit a sum into an account for you and the boy that will mean neither of you ever have to worry about anything again, for the rest of your lives." Imani was silent for a long moment. She looked at the drawings of the gleaming new buildings, at the impossible string of zeros on the transfer form. She gazed at her son, laughing as the pigeons scattered before him. A flicker of deep, profound weariness crossed her face. For a single, fleeting second, Adebayo thought she would accept. Then she looked at him and her eyes were filled with a sorrow so deep it was almost pity. "What's the price?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He laid a second document on top of the first, a non-disclosure agreement, dense with legal clauses, restrictions, and penalties. "You sign this. You move to another continent. You never contact me again. And Kalo never knows who his father is." Her face hardened, the brief flicker of vulnerability gone, replaced by a cold, quiet fury. She slowly pushed the folder back toward him. "My son's soul is not for sale, Adebayo." "This is not about his soul," the magnate countered, his frustration rising. "This is a practical solution to a complex problem." "You are the problem," she declared, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. You think justice is something you can buy in a folder. You think you can pave over a graveyard and call it a garden. She stood up, her entire body trembling. Get away from my child. His rejection was absolute. He had failed. He reported the failure to Zola, whose response was a single chilling text message. Plan B initiated. Plan B was a public execution. It started the next morning. The city's most vicious gossip blog, a Swama insider, published an exclusive. The headline was explosive. Okuro's gold digger, the woman who baited a billionaire with a secret child. The article was a masterpiece of character assassination. It painted Imani as a calculated, manipulative opportunist who had carefully planned her accidental encounter at the train station. Anonymous sources close to the family described her as an unstable grifter who had tried to extort money from Adebayo years ago. The story twisted their past into a sordid tale of obsession and greed. It mentioned her refusal of a generous private offer as proof of her larger, more sinister public ambitions. The piece went viral. The comment section was a cesspool of vitriol. Shameless. Get a job. Trying to trap a rich man. Imani's face was everywhere, her image twisted into that of a predator. Her address, though not explicitly stated, was easily found by online sleuths. That afternoon, someone threw a rock through her living room window. A piece of paper was wrapped around it. On it, one word was scrawled, "Whore." Kalo screamed. His mother grabbed him, shielding his body with her own as she scrambled for the phone, her hands shaking too badly to dial properly. In his penthouse, Adebayo watched the digital storm unfold on a wall of screens. Okuro Power's stock had dipped but was already recovering. Zola's strategy was working. The public narrative was set. The tycoon was the victim, a noble man caught in the trap of a scheming woman. He felt a sickening lurch in his gut. This was not containment. This was destruction. His phone buzzed. It was Zola. "The liability is being neutralized," she said, her voice filled with cool satisfaction. "The board is pleased with how we've handled the narrative. My father sends his regards." Adebayo said nothing. He stared at a picture of Imani online, her face strained and fearful as she was ambushed by a photographer outside her building. He saw the rock sitting on her floor in the background. He had wanted to control the problem. He had wanted to protect his empire. But this was a war against a woman he once loved, and the battlefield was the life of his own son. He had let his fiancée light the match, and now the fire was burning out of control. Adebayo went to her at night. He needed to end this, to force her into submission before Zola's campaign escalated even further. He found her apartment dark, a piece of cardboard taped over the broken window. He knocked harder this time. When she opened the door, she looked like a ghost. Her face was pale, her eyes hollowed out from lack of sleep. She was holding a heavy wooden bat, her knuckles white. "What do you want now?" she whispered, her voice raw. "Haven't you done enough?" He pushed past her into the small living room, the air inside thick with fear. He held up his tablet, the screen glowing with the slanderous blog posts, with the hate-filled comments, with pictures of her own terrified face. "Look at this, Imani," he said, his voice hard, trying to project a control he didn't feel. "Look at the war you've started. It doesn't stop until you accept the offer and leave." She stared at the screen, at the digital assassination of her character. For a moment, she seemed to shrink, to collapse under the weight of it all. Then something inside her snapped. A lifetime of suppressed anger, of quiet dignity under fire, finally erupted. "I started?" she hissed, her voice rising from a whisper to a shaking roar. "You started this, Adebayo. You and your fiancée and her monster of a father. You think this is about money? You think this is about you?" She lunged forward, not at him, but at an old wooden trunk in the corner of the room. She threw it open, her movements frantic, desperate. She pulled out a worn, bulging folder tied together with string. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from the hallway. "You want to know what this is about?" she cried, her voice breaking. "It's about this." She threw the folder onto the small dining table. It landed with a heavy thud, the string snapping. Papers, yellowed and brittle with age, spilled out across the surface. Deeds, affidavits, faded photographs. "You want to see the real story? There it is." Adebayo stared at the mess of documents, his corporate instincts kicking in. "These are just allegations. This is worthless without verification." His voice was cold, a defense mechanism against the rising tide of chaos in the room. "Then verify it," she screamed, grabbing a sheaf of papers and shoving them into his hand. "Look at it, Adebayo. Look at what your kingdom is built on." His eyes fell to the top page. It was a land title transfer for a parcel of land in the Osuba Valley. The date was from 13 years ago. The buyer was a shell corporation he'd never heard of. The seller's signature was a shaky, barely legible X. He flipped to the next page. An affidavit from a village elder detailing how men came in the night, how they were threatened, how they were offered a pittance for land their families had worked for centuries. He kept flipping, page after page. A pattern emerged, a systematic, fraudulent acquisition of land, and then he saw it. A document authorizing payment from the shell corporation. The signature at the bottom was elegant, familiar. Chief Emeka Nwosu. Adebayo felt the air leave his lungs. It was Zola's father, his future father-in-law. He looked up at Imani, his mind reeling. "Nwosu, he was my silent partner on that project. He handled the land acquisition." "He didn't handle it," she said, her voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper. "He stole it. He stole my home. He stole the homes of 200 families. He threatened, he forged, he erased an entire community from the map so you could build your precious dam." The magnate stumbled back, hitting the wall. The dam. The Osuba Valley Dam. It was his first major project, the one that put Okoro Power on the map. The very project that had caused their breakup, when he had accused her of being sentimental, of standing in the way of progress. "I didn't know," he breathed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "You didn't want to know," she retorted, tears finally streaming down her face. "You were so hungry for success you never asked where the land came from. You just built on it. And your entire empire, everything you have, grew from that poisoned soil." He looked at the papers again, his hands trembling. He saw project codes from his own company, internal memos he vaguely remembered signing. He had been so focused on the engineering, the financing, the launch, he had outsourced the local issues to Chief Nwosu, a man he had trusted, a man whose dynasty he was about to marry into. He was not just an unknowing beneficiary, he was complicit. His entire life was a monument to a crime. His success, his engagement to Zola, his public image as a visionary, it was all a lie, a foundational lie. The scandal was not the child. The child was just the catalyst that had brought the past roaring back to life. The real scandal was here, in this dusty folder, in this small, dark apartment, and it was big enough to burn everything to the ground. The press conference was Zola's idea, a final public show of force to solidify their narrative. "You will stand at that podium," she had instructed, her voice crisp and final, "and you will express your regret for Ms. Jabari's clear emotional instability. You will announce a donation to a mental health charity. It will be a masterclass in compassionate control." Now Adebayo stood on the stage, a forest of cameras and microphones before him. The ballroom of the Aswama Grand Hotel was packed. In the front row, Zola sat, a vision in a stark white suit, her expression one of perfect, triumphant composure. Beside her, her father, Chief Emeka Nwosu, beamed, looking every bit the proud patriarch. They believed they were moments away from victory. Adebayo looked out at the sea of expectant faces. He felt a strange, unnerving calm. The fear was gone. The calculation was gone. There was only the truth, heavy and absolute in his gut. He leaned into the microphone. The room fell silent. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady. "There has been a great deal of speculation in the media over the past week concerning my private life. I am here today to set the record straight." He paused, his eyes finding Zola's. He saw the flicker of pride in her gaze. She thought he was following the script. "First," he continued, his voice ringing with clarity, "I want to acknowledge the truth. I have a son. His name is Kelo Jabari Okoro." A gasp rippled through the room. He had given the boy his name. Zola's smile faltered, a hairline crack in her perfect facade. Chief Nwosu's expression tightened. This was not in the script. His mother, Imani Jabari, is a woman I wronged many years ago. The recent stories circulated about her are vicious, calculated lies, and I want to publicly apologize to her and to my son for the pain and suffering my actions and my silence have caused them. The room erupted into a frenzy of murmurs and flashing cameras. Zola's face had gone rigid, her knuckles white where she gripped the armrest of her chair. But that, Adebayo said, his voice dropping, pulling the room back into a tense silence, is not the real reason we are here today. He gestured to the massive screen behind him. It flickered to life, not with the Okoro Power logo, but with a scanned image of a document, a land title from the Osuba Valley. "This is a story about foundations," he said. "The foundations of my company, the foundations of my reputation, and the foundations of my proposed merger with Nwosu Holdings." He clicked a button. The next image appeared, the affidavit from the village elder. Then another, and another. He projected the contents of Amani's folder for the entire world to see. Falsified deeds, coerced signatures, a clear damning trail of systematic fraud. My first major project, the Osuba Dam, was built on land acquired through criminal means. It was stolen from the people of Osuba by my partner at the time. He let the accusation hang in the air for a terrible moment before projecting the final document onto the screen, the authorization for payment from the Shell Corporation. Chief Emeka Nwosu's elegant signature was magnified, undeniable. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the ballroom. All eyes darted to the front row. The chief looked as if he had been turned to stone. Zola shot to her feet, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "This is an outrage! These are baseless lies!" Adebayo ignored her, his voice cutting through the chaos. This merger was to be the joining of two great dynasties. But one of them, and by extension my own, is built on a foundation of lies. I cannot in good conscience proceed. He looked directly at his former fiancée, his expression one of profound, sorrowful finality. "Therefore, effective immediately, my engagement to Zola Nwosu is terminated. The planned merger between Okoro Power and Nwosu Holdings is cancelled." It was a detonation. A multi-billion SETI explosion set off live on every news channel in the country. Reporters were screaming questions. Zola stood frozen, her life's work, her entire legacy, crumbling around her in real time. "And finally," Adebayo declared, his voice barely audible over the din, "to begin to atone for my own willful blindness in this matter, I am stepping down as CEO of Okoro Power. A majority of my personal assets will be placed into a restitution trust for the displaced families of the Osuba community, to be administered by Imani Jabari." He turned and walked off the stage, leaving behind the ruins of his empire. Months later, the dust had not settled. It had simply shifted. The Nwosu name was toxic, their company buried under federal investigations and lawsuits. Okoro Power's stock had plummeted, and Adebayo was a pariah in the world he once ruled. He was no longer a billionaire. He was just a man standing in a public park in the Bako Quarter. He watched as a small boy laughed, chasing pigeons in the afternoon sun. "Kylo," Imani stood nearby, watching him. Her expression was no longer angry, but it was not yet soft. It was cautious, guarded. He walked over to her, his hands in his pockets. The silence between them was not heavy, but it was not light either. It was just space, room to breathe. "They've started clearing the ground for the new community center," she said quietly. "That's good," he replied. Kalo ran up to them, holding out a small smooth stone he had found. He offered it not to his mother, but to Adebayo, a simple, unspoken gesture. The former tycoon crouched down, taking the stone. His hand, for the first time, did not tremble. He looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw not a variable or a problem, but just a boy. He was starting over from nothing, from the truth, and it was the first real foundation he had ever built.